ההרצאה הבאה היא של פרופסור לורנס קפלן, מרצה לפילוסופיה יהודית במחלקה למדעי היהדות באוניברסיטת מקגיל בקנדה. Between Space and Time, Abraham Joshua Heschel on the Religious Significance of the Land of Israel.
Thank you. Abraham Joshua Heschel's sustained engagement with the classic Zionist themes of the land, people, and state of Israel was expressed late in his life in his book Israel, an Echo of Eternity, written in 1967-68 when he was over 60 years old. I would note, however, that Heschel was commissioned by the Anti-Defamation League to write the book against the background of Christian criticism of Israel in the wake of the 67 war for the purpose of explaining to Christians the Jewish people's passionate attachment to the land of Israel. This is the only book, then, that Heschel wrote on commission and not based on an inner call. As a result, the book is uneven. Much of it is potted history, even if written in with Heschel's customary eloquence. Standard defenses of Israel against hostile criticism, however justified such defenses might be, and the like. But still, no book of Heschel can be entirely without theological depth. At the core of this book, then, are the different ways Heschel attempts to account for the religious significance that the land of Israel holds for the Jewish people. In this paper, I will examine these various ways and seek to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses. The main problem Heschel's attempt to account for the land of Israel's religious significance encounters is that throughout his previous body of work, we've spoken about this already, Heschel consistently downplays the religious significance of space as contrasted with that of time. This contrast of space and time to the religious and moral credit of time at the expense of space is the central theme of Heschel's classic work, The Sabbath, but it also occupies a prominent place in Man is Not Alone, The Earth is the Lord's, and particularly God in Search of Man. One should differentiate, however, between this contrast significance in the Sabbath and in God in Search of Man. In the Sabbath, Heschel famously declares Judaism's religion of time aimed at the sanctification of time. He goes on to maintain that Jewish ritual may be characterized as architecture in time. The symbol of the central role that time plays in Judaism, Heschel declares, is the Sabbath, which he poetically describes, you've spoken about this already, as a palace in time. But what do time and space signify in the Sabbath? Heschel begins the Sabbath thus. Technical civilization is man's conquest of space. It is a triumph frequently achieved by sacrificing an essential ingredient of existence, namely time. Almost immediately after the statement, Heschel, in describing the realm of time, implicitly contrasts it with space. There is a realm of time where the goal is not to have, but to be, not to own, but to give, not to control, but to share, not to subdue, but to be in accord. Thus, living in time is characterized by being, giving, sharing, and being in accord, while living in space is characterized by having, owning, controlling, and subduing. Perhaps the best expression of this opposition, Heschel notes towards the end of the Sabbath, is that while every one of us occupies a portion of space to the exclusion of everyone else, no one exclusively possesses time. We share time, we own space. Through my ownership of space, I am a rival to all other beings. Through my living in time, I am a contemporary of all other beings. If the main contrast, animating and pervading all of Heschel's thought, as Shai Held contends in his new monograph about Heschel, is that between reflexive concern for the self, and transitive concern for the other, then time is linked to transitive concern and space to reflexive concern. However, I'd argue that the contrast between time and space as conceived in God in Search of Man is different than in the Sabbath. The chapters on time and God in Search of Man appear in the section on Revelation. Here, Judaism is not just a religion of time, but also a religion of history. Indeed, to Heschel, time and history are synonymous. Time here stands for the unique, singular, unprecedented historical event, foremost among which was the revelatory event, the revelatory moment at Mount Sinai. In contrast to the uniqueness and singularity of the historical event, the historic space is a realm characterized more by likeness and homogeneity. To cite a critical passage, unless we learn, I'm quoting from Heschel, how to appreciate and distinguish moments of time, unless we become sensitive to the uniqueness of historical events, the meaning of revelation, so you see the connection with revelation, will remain obscure. Indeed, uniqueness is a category that belongs more to the realm of time than to that of space. Two stones, two things in space may be alike. 2 hours in a person's life or 2 ages in human history are never alike. The age of Pericles or the period of the Renaissance were never duplicated. It is because of his profound sense of time that the biblical man was able to comprehend that at Sinai he witnessed an event without parallel in human history. That's the end of the quote. Israel, an echo of eternity, reflects this time-oriented approach. Indeed, at the book's beginning, Heschel cites almost an entire page from the Sabbath, elaborating upon the religious centrality and holiness of time. In Israel, an echo of eternity, as in the Sabbath and God in search of man, time remains the realm in which man encounters God. To cite a striking passage from Israel, time is not an empty dimension. It can be a palace of meaning if we know how to build it with precious deeds. Our imperishable homeland is in God's time. We enter God's time, through the gate of sacred deeds. The deeds, acts of sanctifying time, are the old ancestral ground where we meet him again and again. So how then in Israel, an echo of eternity, does Heschel account for the holiness accruing to a particular place, namely the land of Israel? I'd like to show that his attempt to come to grips with this issue brings to light an ironic turn in his thought. Shortly after the appearance of the Sabbath, Trudy Weiss-Rosmarin, the learned combative editor of the Jewish Spectator, wrote a highly critical review of the book in Judaism magazine, taking sharp issue with Heschel's emphasis on the centrality of time in Judaism. Among her many arguments, she averred that in light of modern science, particularly the theory of relativity, I quote, space and time are now recognized as virtually identical. Indeed, again, Trudy Weiss-Rosmarin, time turns out to be a dimension of space. Heschel replied to Weiss-Rosmarin's critique in his essay Space, Time, and Reality, the Centrality of Time in the Biblical View, later included as an appendix in the expanded version edition of the Sabbath. In his essay, Heschel rebuts Weiss-Rosmarin's attempt to reduce time to a dimension of space, maintaining to the contrary, I quote, that the theory of relativity does not in the least eliminate the distinction between time and space, nor does it deprive time of its peculiarly temporal character. Moreover, Heschel goes on to say, space and time mean something totally different in philosophy and religion from what they mean in physics. Certainly in metaphysics, Heschel concludes, the heterogeneity of time and space has not lost its validity. We now come to Israel, an echo of eternity. It is only about slightly more than halfway through the book, towards the end of the chapter between hope and distress, that Heschel raises the questions. What is so precious about this land? What is the magnetic quality of its atmosphere? In a key passage, following the approach he took in the Sabbath and in God in Search of Man, maybe more in accord with the latter than the former, he answers as follows. We must seek to understand Israel reborn in the light of history from the perspective of time. It is a land where not a spot is visible that is not reflecting an event, a moment. It is a land where time transcends space, where space is a dimension of time. When you think of Israel, you think of events of breakthroughs in history. Thus, while in his essay Space, Time, and Reality, Heschel criticizes Trudy Weiss-Rosmarin for reducing time to a dimension of space, in Israel, an echo of eternity, in order to accord religious significance to the land of Israel, he reduces its space to a dimension of time. So much for the heterogeneity of time and space. In truth, already in the Sabbath, Heschel had reduced space to a dimension of time. Thus, in the book's epilogue, he wrote, to the spiritual eye, space is frozen time, and all things are petrified events. One may say that pressed by Weiss-Rosenmann's critique, Heschel backed away from this reduction of space to a dimension of time, affirming the heterogeneity of time and space, only to return to this reduction in Israel, an echo of eternity. Indeed, immediately after affirming in Israel, an echo of eternity, that the land of Israel is a land where space is a dimension of time, Heschel goes on to say that the land of Israel is memory, frozen faithfulness, thus echoing the passage from the epilogue, from the appendix I just cited. From the appendix, space is frozen time. From Israel, an echo of eternity, the land of Israel is frozen faithfulness, faithfulness to a moment. What's gone wrong here? I would suggest that Heschel makes things unnecessarily difficult for himself by identifying history with time. True, what characterizes historical events is their pastness, but the historical events themselves, like all events, as Heschel acknowledges in his appendix to the Sabbath, occurred and occur in time and space. Heschel, as we saw, states, two ages in human history are never alike. The age of Pericles or the period of the Renaissance were never duplicated. But we do not just speak of the age of Pericles, but also, perhaps primarily, speak of Periclean Athens. We don't just refer to the period of the Renaissance, but to the civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, to the Northern Renaissance, to the English Renaissance. Heschel is thus correct when he states, so you must seek to understand Israel, reborn in the light of history, but he unnecessarily complicates matters when he adds from the perspective of time. Thus, when I visit Beit El, I recall God's encounter with Jacob there. The encounter was a historical event, but it occurred in Beit El, the very place I am visiting. It is the particular place of Beit El which carries me back in time to the historical event which took place in time and space over 3,000 years ago at Beit El. Or, if God-man encounters are not your cup of tea, if I visit Mount Tabor, I am carried back in time to the victory of Deborah over the forces of Sisera. But that is precisely because the victory occurred at the very place at which I am standing. HaKochavim b'msilotam nilchamu im Sisera. Nachal Kishon garafam. Nachal Kedumim. Nachal Kishon. Indeed, Beit El, Har Tabor, and Nachal Kishon, in all their particularity, in all their concreteness, reflect historical events. But can we draw from that the conclusion that the land of Israel is a land where space is a dimension of time? In sum, had Heschel not reduced history to time, he could have better accounted for the significance of the very physical land of Israel in the light of the Jewish people's history in that land. There's another instance where, in my view, Heschel makes things unnecessarily difficult for himself. Heschel very movingly portrays the miracle of Israel reborn against the Jewish people's suffering, anguish, and martyrdom during the Holocaust. This leads him, however, to offer a, at least in my view, problematic explanation of the contemporary holiness of the land of Israel. He asks, why was Mount Moriah chosen to be the site on which to build the Temple of the Holy of Holies rather than Mount Sinai, on which the Ten Commandments were given? The answer offered is that Mount Moriah is the site where Abraham sacrificed his beloved son, and the sanctity of sacrifice transcends the sanctity of the commandments. Heschel continues, infinitely greater than the sacrifice of Isaac was the martyrdom of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Treblinka, and others. The state of Israel was built on that martyrdom. The rescue of a people from physical oppression and even destruction from the corroding influence of assimilation, the reclamation of the land from the aridity and barrenness to which most of its soil has been condemned by man and nature, is an act of sanctification. Setting aside the problematic nature of the contention that the sanctity of sacrifice transcends the sanctity of the commandments, one notes a rhetorical slippage here from rescue from physical oppression to rescue from the corroding influence of assimilation to the reclamation of the land from aridity and barrenness. The answer I always heard to the question as to why Mount Moriah was chosen to be the site on which to build the temple rather than Mount Sinai is that only man, not God, can permanently sanctify land. Indeed, at the beginning of the Sabbath and of Israel in echo eternity, Heschel notes that as the Jewish people, not God who sanctifies the land, but does not elaborate on this point. In truth, this idea fits in very well with his views regarding time and place. For if a land or place will be sanctified by God, then given the tangible, concrete nature of the land and place, the very real danger exists of the land or place becoming a fetish. With regard to the means of sanctification, Heschel would have done well to have cited the famous declaration of Maimonides in Hilchot Beit HaBechira that the first sanctification of the land wrought by Joshua via conquest was only temporary, and it was only the second sanctification of the land wrought by Ezra via chazakah, settlement and reclamation, that was permanent. Kidshal shata, kidshal atid lavo. It is not sacrifice, not suffering, not martyrdom, but settlement and reclamation that sanctify the land. Heschel in the passage cited seems to be moving toward this position, but does not quite reach it. To review, Heschel is correct in first seeking to understand Israel, reborn in the light of history, and second in his appreciation that only the people, not God, can sanctify the land. But he would have strengthened his arguments had he not reduced history to time, and had he viewed sanctification more through the prism of settlement than through that of sacrifice. There are two places in Israel, in Echo of Eternity, where, in my view, Heschel's very fine intuitions penetrate deeper into the needs of the current hour than his theoretical views might seem to allow for. First, I cited earlier the following passage. I'm going to repeat it, but I left out one sentence. Time is not an empty dimension. It can be a palace of meaning if we know how to build it with precious deeds. Our imperishable homeland is in God's time. We enter God's time through the gate of sacred deeds. The deeds, acts of sanctifying time, right, are the old ancestral ground where we meet him again and again. Time's centrality in this passage is undeniable. But suddenly and unexpectedly, yet with sure insight, he concludes, and this is a sentence I didn't quote earlier, the great sacred deed for us today is to build the land of Israel. To build the land of Israel, not palaces in time, but dwellings on earth. And last, in a remarkable passage, remarkable precisely because of its prosaic, non-theological, almost secular character, Heschel writes, Israel is a country where a full Jewish life can be lived in accord with tradition and conscience, where the Sabbath fills the streets, not only the homes, where the language is Hebrew. Every people has a right to its own territory in which it can develop its own culture and strive for making a contribution to the world out of its own spirit. Here Heschel does not speak about sanctification, martyrdom, or sacrifice. He does not speak of frozen faithfulness, of a land where time transcends space, where space is a dimension of time. Here it is Heschel, the cultural Zionist, who is speaking, perhaps the religious cultural Zionist. Heschel, who here proves himself to be, like his great rival and opponent Mordechai Kaplan, to be the disciple of Achad Ha'am, and who understands that if a people is to develop a full and vibrant culture, what it requires first and foremost is not a palace in time, no matter how magnificent, but a concrete place and territory over which it can exercise control. An unexpected conclusion indeed. But if, as Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, last sentence, but if, as Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote at the very beginning of Israel, an echo of eternity, first words, July 1967, I have discovered a new land. Israel is not the same as before. In light of these words, we may say that after Heschel had the galvanizing experience of visiting that new land, Heschel himself was not the same before, was a new Heschel, ready and energized to draw new and unexpected conclusions.